Well, hello everyone, and welcome to A Good Place where truth and integrity meet, where I'll be introducing you to today's premier whistleblowers, educators, authors, journalists, humanitarians, activists, celebrities, and downright interesting people. They all have one thing in common, though. They are people of truth and integrity. And I have one of those noble guests today. His name is Patrick Basham. And Patrick is a former adjunct scholar and senior fellow at the Cato Institute and the founding director since 2006 of the Democracy Institute, which can be found at democracyinstitute.org. Basham was previously the founding director of the Social Affairs Center at the Canadian Fraser Institute, and he has published a number of best-selling books and contributed articles to a range of major newspapers. His articles have appeared in the HuffPost, The Guardian, the New York Times, and many other well-known sources, many television and radio shows, and many of these are available on the website under the website's archives. Basham studied political science at Carleton University, the University of Houston, and the University of Cambridge, earning a BA, MA, and Ph.D. degrees, respectively. So, Patrick, thank you so much for coming on.
It's my great pleasure to be with you.
Okay, so I guess one of the things we can do is maybe we can talk about your journey that led you to where you are now.
Sure. I'll try to make it as brief and painless for your listeners as possible. As you may be able to tell from my voice, I am originally from the United Kingdom, although a sort of somewhat exotic part of the United Kingdom called the Channel Islands. Guernsey and Jersey are the major Channel Islands. They're just off the northwest coast of France in the English Channel. And I began life there, but I've lived in chunks in countries like Canada, Australia, several times in the UK, and I've been based in the United States in the Washington, D.C. area since just a few months before 9/11. So I'm a little bit of a gypsy, but hopefully that helps inform me when I'm thinking about public policy and trying to explain to others how at least I see the world working, how it doesn't work so well maybe in some areas, and how it should work better.
Okay. And then you became interested in politics, and with all your global travels and places that you've lived in your vagabond days, I don't know if you're still traveling. Let's talk about your website. It's an interesting website. I've heard about it before. And tell me about the inception of this organization.
Sure. The organization, the Democracy Institute, was founded in January of 2006. So we're just over 13 years old. We are a public policy research organization, which is the fancy way of saying that we're a think tank. At least that's what they call groups like ours, in the Washington area. It was inside the Beltway. Which means that we do research on, in our case, a whole host of issues and topics, things that are either in the public eye or angles on issues that we think should be and that we see coming over the horizon. So we write books and articles and appear in the media and hold conferences, all those sorts of things. We raise our money from private sources. We don't take any government money. So individuals and companies, large and small, provide us with donations, large and small, and that's how we keep the lights on. And we attempt to explain the world as we see it to our respective audiences, and to most importantly, we try to engage in conversations with people, whether they're policymakers or just ordinary folks. And in some areas where there isn't a debate, there's just a monologue going on in the public sphere, we try to initiate a debate, because we think arguably the most important thing is that there is a public conversation, that well-intentioned people can engage in dialogue and debate without name-calling and without, flame-throwing rhetoric. And if we all did more of that, we'd make more progress towards the goals that most of us really share, whether or not we realize it or not.
Mm-hmm. And then about us, it kind of sums up exactly what you were discussing. The Democracy Institute is a politically independent public policy research organization based in Washington and London. And this think tank serves to further public education through the production and dissemination of accessible commentary and scholarship, the Democracy Institute aims to provide a balanced and thoughtful perspective on topical issues, promoting open and rational debate and based on evidence rather than ideology. So it's very similar to what you said. And I was just looking at your, earlier I was studying to see exactly what you guys do. You want to talk about some of your previous work in detail and depth, like what's been the most important stories that you've covered?
Sure. There are sort of two or three areas over my career, certainly over the last 10 or 15 years, and my colleagues, that where I think we've either had the most impact or said, from our point of view, the most important things. It probably won't surprise your listeners that given that we're called the Democracy Institute, we're very interested in democracy. And the area that I began work on when I was still at the Cato Institute and have continued to this day is on the whole issue of democratization. You know, the notion, the plan from the U.S. government, for example, post 9/11, to attempt to democratize the Middle East as much as possible. We saw that both with Iraq and Afghanistan, and then more recently after the Arab Spring in 2011, invasion of Libya, what happened in Egypt. You know, a great deal of good intention and blood and treasure spent to turn long-standing authoritarian regimes, countries into liberal democracies. I was very unpopular in Washington about 14, 15 years ago when I was one of the first people to be masochistic enough to publicly say that none of this was going to work out. Unfortunately, it was not going to work out, at least not in the short to medium term. So we've continued to research and argue in that regard. Another area which will seem quite different to your listeners, but I think equally important in the modern contemporary period, is the whole issue of what we call the nanny state. And by that I mean the increasing tendency of governments at the local level, state level, federal level, globally through the United Nations, for example, to tell us as individuals what we should eat, drink, and smoke, and how we should or shouldn't enjoy our recreational activities. So the tangible outlet of that is the way that governments regulate, and some cases outright prohibit things in the areas of smoking and food and beverages and gambling, medical marijuana, all of these things. So in most of these areas, I think it's been regressing. We've been seeing more and more government intervention and less individual personal freedom. Although in some areas, medical marijuana being probably the best example, there has been some movement in, from my perspective, a more sort of progressive and positive direction. So what we're trying to show, whether it's democratization, whether it's the nanny state, or a whole host of other issues and topics that we are interested in and talk and write about, we're trying to show in each case whether any given government policy or direction or intervention, regulation, is actually likely to achieve its objectives. In some cases, the answer is yes. In many cases, not. And more often than not, what we need to stress, and we try to stress to folks, is that for whatever crisis or problem the government is trying to fix, and often with the best of intentions, history tells us that there are always going to be unintended consequences to that action, and those unintended consequences are usually going to be negative. And so there always needs to be an appreciation of the whole picture, the big picture, and the pros and cons of any policy, because although you can't always know what's going to happen, we do know enough from history to tell us that there will be these problems. And even if the crisis is real, even if it has been accurately diagnosed, which often is not the case, that you still have to be aware of the problems that you will unintentionally create. And if you can forecast those, get your arms around those, you can at least minimize the damage and maybe even maximize the benefit of whatever the policy is.
Mm-hmm. Donald, would you like to ask some questions?
Sure. This is Donald Jeffries. I'm Ella's pretty much consistent co-host here. I looked at your list of books. Very interesting stuff. So as someone who smoked a long time ago, I quit a long time ago. I still kind of have a fire in me over the way smokers are not even second-class citizens. I don't know what kind of class they're treated like now, but why don't they, from the standpoint of you, what you're writing about, why do you think that they just don't ban tobacco? If it's that bad, because to me it seems like smokers get the worst of both worlds, and as you probably know, smokers are disproportionately come from lower income backgrounds. So just constantly raising taxes on product, it affects them. I don't understand if it's so deadly and it can't be done, then why is it legal? Why is tobacco still legal if they're basically telling you it's going to kill you to smoke it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful question. It's a great question. It's really the most important question, which is a lead-in into saying that I may not have the best answer, but I'll take a crack at it. I think there are two reasons, and both parts of my answer are cynical, but I think they're accurate. One is that today, and for some time in this country and in most countries in the West, it is the government that is the one that profits from the tobacco industry. Yes, the tobacco industry, the companies make a lot of money, but in most cases, most of the price of a packet of cigarettes, a carton of cigarettes, goes in tax to the government. And governments have become dependent on that revenue. And so for PR reasons, and in many cases, personal angst against cigarettes or the tobacco industry itself, politicians from most parties, from most points on the spectrum, they rail against the industry and they try to constrain it and restrict it and not regulate it to death, but regulate it at least into the ditch. But they will not ban it, in part because they are so dependent on the money. And the second reason they don't do it, which is going to sound at first a little counterintuitive, given what you were saying about smokers having become at best second-class citizens, which I completely agree with, is that although smokers have been relegated to that status, and on a day-to-day basis, most of them have been made to feel quite guilty about their habit and to go along with all of the bans and restrictions, and shivering outside in the cold, on their smoke breaks. The one thing that would change all of that is if consuming the product was actually prohibited, because then it would go from being something that was difficult to consume, expensive to consume, to something that you were forbidden from consuming. Then at that tipping point, I think then you would actually see a grassroots, popular revolt, because although smoking is now a minority habit, you're still talking about tens upon tens of millions of people in America alone. And there would be a consumer revolution. And so the governments are aware they can't afford to ban smoking for the financial reason, and they can't afford to do it for the political reason either.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to mention to Donald, in Europe, and I know it's changed in Europe as well. People would smoke like in social settings at the restaurant. It was done differently, and so we're not talking about like low income. I mean, these are people who are financially stable to Europe standards. I mean, going to Paris, and people will be out at the sitting outside in the cafes, having coffee, chatting, and smoking. Though I do, from what I understand, it has changed. I haven't been there since this occurred. What's your opinion on that, Pat?
Yeah, it's that is one of the elements of the what I call the denormalization of the tobacco industry, and particularly of smokers themselves, making them appear to be abnormal or unusual people. That's one of the elements that, of course, is brushed aside. The fact that smoking is not simply someone getting a nicotine hit, almost like they're taking a hit of crack cocaine or shooting themselves up with heroin. That's the way the public health people and the government would like to present it, because it reinforces the notion that you're doing something wrong and that you're somehow strange or ill. There's just, you need to be helped away from this. When in fact, historically, and even in the modern era, as you suggest, many people who smoke do so as much as a social exercise as anything else. It's something that people enjoy doing with others. And there's the whole ritual of smoking. I mean, whether it's cigarettes, pipes, cigars, there's a culture around it. Now, it's a smaller culture than it was, but you're right, in other parts of the world, Western Europe being a good example, the French, a very good example, where, comparatively speaking, more people still smoke, and they still smoke in ways that are about interacting with other people and not huddled away against the building. Well, these days you actually have to usually be away from the building. You can't even huddle against the building. You have to huddle on your own in the parking lot. But so yes, it's a good example of how we, for the best of intentions, we regulate a habit, a consumption pattern, but we do so ignoring many of the nuances and elements that go into why people consume that product. And therefore, when you try to attack that behavior, you're missing key elements, and so you don't necessarily get the results you think you get. I mean, given all the money and all the regulations and all the restrictions on smoking, you would think that no one would smoke anymore. There's so little upside to it, but tens of millions of people still do. So the regulations aren't getting it right, or they're not getting it right enough.
I agree. When you talked about the nanny state earlier that you think America has, what does that say about America when we're more regulated in areas like this than socialist nations like France and all the nations of Europe that we decry? I mean, we think of that as being a nanny state, but they don't have anywhere near the regulations on this kind of personal behavior. What America's, this is the kind of curious state we've built here, where we kind of have a nanny state that doesn't return very many services, but does control behavior.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, some people put it down to a more puritanical streak, going back to colonial times and all of that. And I think there's an element of that, although probably more in the area of sort of sex broadly defined than in terms of what you eat and drink and smoke and all of that. I think it's more about the influence over the past generation or two that a very sort of self-described liberal progressive mindset has had on the culture and on policy making. And that's sort of an elaborate way of saying that I think a lot of those folks who've been making the decisions at the government level are people who think that America is a pretty good place to live, but she'd be a lot better if she was more like, I don't know, Sweden, or what they view as a kind of a nirvana of social democratic Nordic countries, somewhere in Europe that they've read about, when they were in college. And they think that if the government only controlled what we did more, that not too much, they would argue, but just a little more, then we would, we'd be less violent, and Americans would eat less, fast food, and they'd smoke less, and they'd gamble less, and all of that, and we'd just all be better off in all kinds of ways. But that's based. I mean, I think the idea is wrong, the premise is wrong, and the execution is wrong, and all of that. But I think it stems from this misguided notion of what actually is going on in Europe, because although the Europeans are generally and still much more keen to have the government have a say in the economy, and you touched on the welfare state, have a much more expensive and comprehensive welfare state, Europeans tend to be far more protective of their rights as individuals, on privacy, and on these issues of what I do in my day-to-day life, what I eat, what I drink, whether I can wager on sports or that kind of thing. So it is, as though America is such a huge country in so many ways, it is fascinating and a little unnerving, I think, how a relatively small number of people over the past generation or two have been able to have this kind of influence, largely because they envy another country or other countries who they mistakenly think are doing it better than we are here.
Mm-hmm. And you've also written a book on the topic of nicotine and cigarette smoking. This is a debatable topic, but just so people know that there is a book that you'd written, and maybe you can tell people where to get that.
Yeah, the books are either available through our website, which you kindly mentioned earlier, democracyinstitute.org, or through Amazon, Amazon Books. And I just wanted to stress for your listeners, because I need to do this often when I'm speaking to groups of various kinds on these nanny state issues, but particularly the tobacco issue. And that is, I'm a lifelong non-smoker. I'm actually allergic to tobacco. And so my interest in the issue is not about, the last thing I'm trying to do is promote smoking or excuse. It's not that at all. I'm not placing a value judgment. I'm trying to explain to folks that if you want less smoking, for example, if you want a healthier lifestyle, that there are different ways of going about it. You don't have to necessarily accept that the government knows best approach is the only way, and that there aren't any negative consequences to that. And so that's kind of a prism or a mindset, a model that I try to apply across all of these nanny state issues. We may all agree on what's good and bad, but that doesn't end the argument, end the debate. It shouldn't. Just because people have good intentions doesn't mean they actually know how to get from A to Z in policy terms.
Mm-hmm. And then you've written other books too. Do you care to maybe give us a synopsis of your other books?
Sure. I'll just touch on two or three, so I don't bore your listeners too much. Just that we're talking Nanny State. A number of years ago, 2011, I guess, I co-authored a book on gambling, and the argument there was that for the debate continues to be about whether or not a new casino or being able to gamble online. The critics say it's a bad thing because you have more people get into trouble, they get into debt, and there's crime and all sorts of problems associated with it. And then the industry people say, yes, but we provide a lot of jobs and a lot of tax money. And although I deal specifically with both of those claims, and I find that both of them are overblown. A casino isn't bad for a location, but it's not a silver bullet economically, and nor are the problems associated with it anything like as great as the critics suggest. But the argument of the book is that there are actually huge social benefits rather than costs to gambling. Not that there aren't any costs, but they're largely overwhelmed by benefits, most of which are never considered and often are very hard to measure. And they include things like the socialization benefits that people receive. There's a lot of research now that shows that older retired people who often spend a lot of time, whether it's playing bingo or going on organized trips to casinos, that they do far better in terms of their cognitive skills, Alzheimer's, those kinds of degenerative problems, if they gamble than if they don't, because they are using, they're literally using their brains. And of course, they have the benefits of socialization, which helps fight the loneliness, which is a huge health problem for older people. So across all groups, genders, demographic groups, etc., ages, there's an upside which isn't discussed, which is counterintuitive to many people. But if any of your listeners are kind enough to look at the book, hopefully they'll appreciate there is another side to the argument. A very different book that I wrote in early 2016 was on foreign policy, which incorporated a lot of the work I'd done, a lot of the thinking I'd done on democratization, which I discussed earlier. But basically, it was laying out a way of looking at American foreign policy going forward, with a statement, with a preface that the previous 16 years had been unsuccessful. So whether it was George W. Bush trying to democratize the Middle East, or whether it was Barack Obama ignoring the rise of ISIS and trying to make the world a better place by just playing nice with everyone, my argument was that we need to return to a more not isolationist foreign policy, but a more realistic and pragmatic foreign policy that puts America's strategic interest number one, doesn't ignore other concerns like humanitarianism and human rights and other extremely important elements, but that fundamentally places the security of the country first, the security of its allies, and by doing that, would be in a stronger position diplomatically, economically, to do and achieve other, noble goals. And then lastly, most recently, just before the turn of the year, I wrote an ebook on another very different topic, but a very current topic, which is Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. And the reason I did that and what the book is all about is it's not an investment guide. I'm not an expert on telling people whether they should or shouldn't invest or how they should invest their money. But what it does is it provides policymakers and regulators with a template for understanding what this stuff is, what this new technology, what it means, what its potential is, which I think is far more positive than your average daily newspaper headline would suggest, and therefore how to regulate it. Because governments everywhere right now, they either are or they will be panicking about what to do about this stuff. They know it's there or it's coming. They know it's important, but they don't know if it's dangerous. They don't know if it's a good thing. And most of the people making these judgments are middle-aged and older people, mostly men, who are not very tech savvy. They probably can't even use Facebook, let alone have any idea.
Thinking about that a couple of days ago.
I touch on it early in the book. I use the sort of the anecdote. You guys may recall that last year when Mark Zuckerberg was before Congress, before the committee investigating what was going on with Facebook, etc., and many of the questions and the comments that he received indicated very, very vividly that the person asking the question had absolutely no idea how Facebook worked, probably had no idea how the internet worked, and all of that. So all to say, it's not a matter of, I'm not saying any of this, and I don't say this in the book to criticize anyone or to call anybody bad names. It's simply to say that to recognize that the people who are going to be making the decisions for this new massive industry and for the huge number of consumers of that industry need help, because their default position as politicians is always to tax out of existence or to ban, can prohibit something they don't understand and that therefore they're scared of. So I'm trying to explain it's not scary. It's difficult to understand, but it's not scary. It's important. It's here to stay. And you need to get your arms around it, sooner rather than later.
And one thing I wanted to ask you before we move along here is, what exactly is Bitcoin? Some of my listeners may not have any idea what that is and how it works and where it came from.
I apologize in advance because it's impossible to do it in 30 seconds or put it on a bumper sticker.
That's okay. We still have 30 minutes left. So it's going to be a good teaching lesson. Yeah.
Oh, goodness. So Bitcoin is the original of what are now over 1,000 cryptocurrencies or digital currencies. So this is digital money. This is virtual money. And it doesn't require, one of the many advantages to it is it doesn't require a bank. You don't have to have a bank account. You don't have to have what the finance people call a third party between you and the person you're selling something to or you're buying something from or whatever it might be, because it's all controlled by basically a computer network, a virtual accounting ledger. And to skip, a million technical steps, what that means is that this ledger makes it impossible for anyone to buy something with money they don't have. You can't steal someone's money. You can't commit fraud in terms of purchasing or selling here, because a whole bunch of computers instantaneously verify that those funds are there and allow the transaction to go through. And so this means that the cost is way down. So you have, for example, just give you one example of how the potential of this is that, a company like Western Union, which makes its money sending money home from, in the case of the United States, foreign workers who send huge amounts of sums home to their families, in, for example, Central, Latin, South America. the cost by doing it through cryptocurrency, through Bitcoin, is fractional of what they would normally charge people, and it's just there are all kinds of ways in which it is seeping into the culture. I mean, the pizza chain Domino's just yesterday announced that they're going to start accepting Bitcoin. There are companies here and there, a lot of companies online. The main reason that your listeners may not be that familiar with it is that it hasn't yet become a part of people's everyday lives. And I argue in the book that the main reason for that is not because it's so dangerous and so risky the way that its critics would suggest. It's because it hasn't in most places been regulated yet. And so it remains somewhat of a wild west. You know, there is some risk involved because there isn't the rubber stamp of government saying this is how this works and this is what, these are the rules and all of that. Many people in the industry want those rules because they want that clarity and that certainty, because then they can go about promoting and marketing their wares, and the average potential consumer can recognize and appreciate that this is something which is operating within certain bounds, is a legitimate way of using one's money and investing one's money, etc. So there's two real ways in which this is going to go forward. There's the investment side, which is what you hear about every day. The price of Bitcoin is up and down and all of that. And the other way, which I think is potentially long-term, the real change agent here, the way that the financial system is really going to change, is as a medium of exchange, that people, I think, are going to eventually start spending Bitcoins, using Bitcoins to buy their Starbucks coffee, to order their flights online, to book their flights online, and all of this, and apparently now even their pizzas, at least from Domino's. So it has these two elements, the investment element, and it has the consumer element. If governments don't, throw the baby out with the bathwater, then I think they can both thrive, but it's all to be decided.
Mm-hmm. And then what about the downside? Because I know there's a lot to that, and we should do both sides of the coin, pun intended.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things I do in the book is I go through all of the criticisms, which, of which there are many, and, most days the business section of the newspaper will contain at least one, if not more of them. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the price volatility in terms of, if we look at the investment side of it, Bitcoin reached almost 20,000 at the end of 2017, and now it's a few $1,000s and all of this. And there's no question there's volatility, partly for the reasons I suggest. But we have to keep this in perspective. There are many major currencies, traditional currencies out there that are going up and down 30, 40, 50% over the course of a matter of months or a year in some cases. Now, I'm not suggesting, therefore, volatility is great, but what I'm trying to suggest is that we need to have some perspective that, if you're investing in currencies, you either, you make a decision, you're willing to take the risk, you're willing to wait to the long term, or whatever your investment, model is. But cryptocurrencies are no different from any other currencies, and they're also subject to fraud. I mean, much is made of the fraud that's gone on, the hacking of sites, and all this sort of thing. And there are certainly well-documented cases of money going missing, and some people have gone to jail, as they should, because some of these smaller cryptocurrencies are scams. Because people are attracted to this notion that there's all this money now going into this new industry. And again, the lack of regulation makes it fairly easy to present yourself as something that you may not be. But again, you have to keep it in perspective and realize that we're not talking about an ideal financial system or finance industry versus Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. The financial institutions and the banks that are well established, barely a week goes by without one of them being successfully hacked, and the account holders' information, being at risk, without a government suing a bank or a number of banks for fraud or whatever. So it's, again, we have a new industry which is learning to crawl, let alone walk, and there are definitely teething problems. But when you see how the long-established, the bricks and mortar banking and financial institutions are still struggling themselves on a regular basis, I think it gives one some appreciation that although the bar should be high for the cryptocurrency industry as it develops, it shouldn't be set so stratospherically high that it's completely unrealistic to assume that they will ever achieve those objectives, because we don't ask that, and we certainly don't receive that from our historic bricks and mortar financial institutions.
And then also there's the dark web, where it's a common use of this type of payment and illegal activities, which you kind of touched upon, and so it's concerning.
Yeah, it's very much a buyer beware right now. You have to do what homework you can do, and we just have to hope that governments decide to sensibly regulate this industry, because if they do that, then not all of the concerns will go away. That's impossible. We're talking about human beings here and self-interest, but most of them can be dealt with and can be managed and contained so that the average person, whether they're investing or they're consuming Bitcoins and other cryptocurrencies, can do so with a sufficient degree of confidence that this is something that is not going to disappear overnight, because of some malfeasance.
Donald?
Yeah, I Patrick, when I was looking at your books, one subject that you seem to have written quite a bit about that really intrigued me was about the obesity in America, and you seem to have a really different perspective on that. You want to explain that subject to people and what your take on it?
Yeah, sure. This is actually, I appreciate you bringing that up, the topic up, because this is one of the better examples of how we have, I think, helped to initiate a debate where there wasn't one. As your listeners are probably aware, it's probably 15 years now, 20 years, pushing 20 years, since the people who know everything informed us that we were all too fat and we were all going to die soon because of it, and the world was going to end if all of the regulations and restrictions that we hear about daily now didn't come into place very, very quickly. And what we did, further to our mission statement, that you heard earlier, we talk about the need for evidence-based policy making. So we actually looked at the statistics and looked at what had happened around the world where some of these policies have been enacted. And we concluded, to cut it relatively short and painless for you and your listeners, we identified three things that we think are really crucial to this debate, and which sadly are still missing from much of it. The first one is just the numbers. The notion that there has been this massive explosion in obesity is simply statistically untrue. It's not that we're not heavier than we were, or that there are some what are referred to as morbidly obese people their health is very seriously at risk. There is a higher number of them than there were a generation ago. But there just hasn't been the explosion. And one of the ways we are able to demonstrate that is that the goalposts for this, the way in which this is measured, there's this body mass index, the BMI measure, which is the one that's used around the world to produce the numbers that you read and see and hear about. That's a very, very bad measure, but forgetting the fact that it can't really do what it says it wants to do. A number of years ago, about 15 or so years ago, when this whole thing started to take on a life of its own, it did so because basically the way in which the body mass index was measured, the numbers were shifted. So overnight you had way more people counting as overweight, especially obese, as you did the day before. And that is, you can argue that that's a more accurate measurement, but you can't get away from the fact that a simple statistical sort of sleight of hand changed everything and started producing these big fat numbers, because the obesity folks, the anti-obesity campaigners, learned from the anti-tobacco campaigners. In fact, mostly they're the same people, that you need those big, fat, scary numbers to get politicians' attention and then to get people to respond. So number one, we argue that there isn't an epidemic. It's a small problem at worst. Secondly, we say, okay, let's say we're completely wrong and the public health people and the politicians are completely right, and this is a huge problem. So what are we going to do about it? So we go through all of the prescriptions and the instruments that have been proposed and in certain places have been enacted. You know, the fat taxes and the sugar taxes and the banning of vending machines and the banning of junk food advertising and all of these things. Again, very similar to what happened with cigarettes. And we explain either why they haven't worked in certain countries, because most of these policies have been tried somewhere, why they haven't worked, or logically why, if they haven't been tried somewhere, why they're unlikely to work. And then lastly, we say, okay, so we've argued that there isn't a problem statistically. We've argued that we hope demonstrated that these proposals, these policies won't work. So why then, it begs the question, why is this happening? Like, why is there this public momentum, or at least political momentum around the world? And the answer to that, we suggest, is that the anti-obesity campaign has become a crusade. It's sort of a cottage industry that has developed. And so, you name the health issue or environmental issue, and there is a cottage industry which grows up around it, where there are huge amounts of money, whether it's from the United Nations, from the US government, you name it, that is going into funding work in this area. And all of that work, all of the funding is to demonstrate that there's a big problem and only the government can solve it. And what runs along with that, because I don't mean to suggest that this is all government's fault, is that there's a lot of private funding for the anti-obesity campaign. And where does that come from? That comes from Big Pharma, because Big Pharma makes the weight loss drugs that they want everyone to take once they're convinced they're too fat. And so you have groups, you have groups that are funded by government or funded by Big Pharma or both. And it is very hard to make a dent into that because the resources are just so overwhelming. So we're really trying to stress that when folks read or hear about the new crisis in health or whatever it is, to look very carefully at who's saying what and where the money comes from, because there seems to be a direct correlation across many of these issues, obesity being one of the better examples. It doesn't matter what the numbers say. There's an argument here. There's a position that's being pushed, and it'll be pushed and pushed and pushed because there is so much power at stake for government, and there's so much money at stake for private corporations, in this case, pharmaceutical companies.
Well, I mean, I agree with almost everything you say. You made a lot of great points, especially about the way obesity is defined now. They've lowered that so much that, so many people that would have never been considered obese before or merely fat or whatever, now they're considered obese. But one thing I think that I just kind of, anecdotal evidence from going out about in society, I do see a lot more overweight people, especially young people. And I believe the average weight for men and women has gone up by 25, 30 pounds or something like that since 1960s. That's what they tell us anyhow. So, I mean, I think there's something there. I agree with you, and I certainly don't want them pulled into big pharma. But is there one thing I don't know what you think of this or not. This is one of my typical ideas. Ella could probably tell you the way I look at things. But one thing I really hate is the way people are. As a fat kid myself, I went through this, and I know what that the kind of discrimination has always existed against overweight people. But I really resent the way, for women especially, they present these skinny supermodel types that are on TV, and more you see them on television shows and movies eating constantly. huge burgers, eat like they have this ravenous appetite. And I know, having known some of these people, what they eat is, is half of them throw up after they eat. They're living on salads because that's the only way they're that thin. I mean, Ella could probably add more to that, having that kind of background.
Yeah. Well, being a former model, I mean, it's really sad. And I worked in high fashion modeling at a very high end. I mean, I just didn't eat. And one thing, the models that did eat, I think I had like 900 calories a day, which is nothing. You should have like 2,000 or so. But yeah. And so exactly. And, and this is sad to say, but models would do cocaine and do all these crazy things to maintain their weight. And it's changed because curvy seems to be a little more acceptable, but still, I'm still thin, and I'll walk and people will say, oh, you have such a nice, but you're the perfect weight. And I think to myself, no, I'm not, because I didn't realize that I just have a thin build, and that eating doesn't change it that much. And so it's just sad. Like you said, you see these skinny women like myself, and people think it's like an attractive thing, and it's not. I try to eat more and try to get my weight back up, but it's just sad. It is. And there's that pressure, and people would be like, oh, you're so thin. I wish I could be thin. And I'm like, no, you don't. Don't go by the way models are. I'll just tell you in a nutshell what modeling's about. You are a hanger for clothes. They don't want curves. You'll take away from the clothing and whatever it is that you're modeling. So just a little FYI there.
And on
I just go ahead, sorry.
I was just saying on my earlier theme about unintended consequences. At the start of the obesity book, we make the point, because the numbers even a decade ago were starting to be there, that all of this focus on thinner is better, and fat is bad. What that's done, it is both boosted the already alarming number figures for girls with eating disorders, but it's also created a new problem, which is there's now a real problem of eating disorders among boys, which, they didn't exist before, but they were minuscule compared with girls. But now boys around, throughout the West are growing up terrified of not being thin, So this is a problem. And another way in which these policies ironically work against each other is simultaneously we're telling all the kids to not smoke or stop smoking, and we're also telling them that they need to be thin. But as I would argue and do argue, not the only reason, not necessarily the first reason for all of them, but one of the principal reasons why young people smoke, particularly teenage girls, is to keep their weight down, right?
You got it.
So if you're telling people you're telling people to be thin, telling kids to be thin, well, there's one easy or comparatively easy way is to smoke cigarettes. But we don't want them to smoke, but we don't want them to gain weight, because on average, regular smoker stops smoking. On average, they gain about 15 pounds, right? Which will put them into a very different category according to the public health folks. So we have to just continually remind ourselves that this stuff sounds easy and it's easy on the blackboard, but when you put it into practice, you're dealing with real people, with real insecurities and real irrational ways sometimes of figuring it all out. But none of this is in isolation. And because it's not in isolation, these policies interact, they overlap, and that gets quite dangerous.
And one thing I just want to add to this conversation is, all this pressure of being thin and losing weight and all these different things. And this was true for me when I was younger, because I started modeling when I was 14 years old. And you're right. I started smoking. I was hiding it. And I'd be starving in the morning. And I'd go down the little side of my house and I'd have a cigarette so I wouldn't eat breakfast. You're absolutely right. And then the other thing is, you become obsessed with food. I know this sounds weird, but when you're dieting, now I never think about that. I have to sometimes remind myself to eat. But when you're obsessed with your weight, that's all you think about. It's just really, that's the flip side on that. And it's sad. But I have to say, here in America with the Kardashians and people that are more fully figured, it is, people, it's changing. And even models, the way the models look, runway is still that way, but actually modeling is almost non-existent because now they have celebrities on the cover of magazines. So, it exists, of course, but not the way it used to. They use celebrities to promote things on covers.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I just would love to see, if I had an idea for, I should try to market this for a reality show. I would love to see behind the scenes with models and actresses that have this, incredible, they don't get a pound, there's not an ounce of fat on them, to show what they do in their daily life, to show what they're eating, how many of them have bulimia and that kind of stuff, and how much they exercise. Because then I think the women that are out there watching, instead of focusing on shaming them the way I look compared to that, they would see, well, God, this is what they have to do to look like that. Because I just think it's a dangerous message when they act like so cavalierly that somebody can eat 3 cheeseburgers a day.
Donald,
and
I hate
ice
to cut
cream.
you off. Donald, I hate to cut you off. We just have a couple more minutes, and I think you should definitely look into that. Definitely, that's something you should do. But what can listeners, how can they support the organizations? I know you have donation on there. And what volunteers opportunities are for them?
Well, we don't have volunteers as such. However, we're always interested in young people who might wish to intern. So if any of your listeners are in that category, or they have children or grandchildren, relatives, friends who would like to intern and learn a little bit about the think tank industry and research and do some work in these areas, we're always, happy to look at CVs and talk to people. And of course, we're always happy to receive donations. So any of the above, gratefully received.
And us too, here at the station on Revolution Radio, we live on our donations too. We're the number one listener supported station, but listener supported is the operative word. So if you go to freedomslips.com and click on the donate button, you'll help keep our lights on. But it is really important, guys. We need to help out. On some degree, I have a percentage that I donate from my income or income that I've made. I just think it's really important, guys. Even if you can't do it and do the activism or whatever your interest is in pursuing his interest, you can still donate to the people who are able to do those things. Are you guys there? Oh,
yeah, absolutely. I agree.
Okay. Patrick, do we still have you?
Yes. I think I may have dropped for a few seconds.
Okay. Do you want to add to that? Because I do think activism is very important.
Oh, it's extremely important. I mean, it's people taking an interest, not letting public life and all this politics and all these issues just sort of wash over them and feeling that they can't do anything about it, because individual phone calls, emails, small donations, they do count. They do add up. And, if everybody took that view, nothing would happen, nothing would change. There wouldn't be the resources to make any long-term, significant, substantive changes. So no one is to be ignored. Everyone should feel included. Everyone should feel like their voice matters.
Okay, so again, democracy, go ahead and give your website one more time.
Yeah, democracyinstitute.org.
And also, thank you guys for joining me for this conversation, and I'll be back next Tuesday at the same time.